Pandas on Parade, episode 3.
Episode 3.
In this episode, we are talking about shoulder cuts.
Yay! This is my favorite. I've been looking forward to this all week. Seriously. Actually, for the last 2 weeks. It's great. I love shoulder cuts.
Why do you love shoulder cuts?
I like shoulder cuts because they're aggressive and they're very assertive, and you have to have presence when you carry them off. And they can be very deceptive. They can be very sneaky, even though they're big.
Big.
They're very large shoulder cuts. You can see them a mile away, but they're very good when you're a small person with a really long sword against a very big opponent. And you could just be terrifying. It's fabulous.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Anyway, shoulder cuts.
We'll look into that. Tonight we're going to be primarily using longswords for our demonstration practice.
Yep.
Because in longswording you tend to use a lot of shoulder cuts for various different ways and for various different reasons. And we find that it's a good demonstration of the fundamentals of shoulder cuts, how to throw them, where they come from, and how to kind of balance what is this very large action with the time and distance to use those actions manipulatively and safely, because that's always the key thing we're looking at in all of these things.
And we haven't given the longsword any love.
We have not.
And we've given all our love to the rapier, which,
Done a lot of rapier.
You know, as much as I hurt the rapier, longsword is my longsword, and some of the other broader sword weapons are where my heart lies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so just because we're using the longsword, and this is one of the big things, is just because we're using longsword doesn't necessarily mean that this is only for longsword. All of this stuff become applicable with other single-handed weapons in various different ways. We've looked at why not to throw shoulder cuts with the rapier,
right?
Over the past couple of episodes, and so now we'll actually get into like how and why and when to use these larger cutting actions. Mm-hmm. So I guess before we get too far started, maybe everybody's hopefully caught up or has any questions on the elbow cuts that we did last time.
Wrist cuts.
The elbow cuts and the wrist cuts we've done the last couple of times, just so that we can hit those and make sure that any of those questions kind of get answered before we dive too deep off the board into longsword and shoulders.
I think I got the beginning of the wrist cuts session. I did not see the elbow cut session at all.
Okay.
Cool.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube.
So you can watch it at your leisure. Mm-hmm. I think it's an hour and a half.
I think we got it down to about an hour and a half.
About the mid-2000s feature film. That
audio, yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing about these sort of online classes, right? I mean, an hour and a half long class is not a lot. We take 2-hour classes at Collegium all the time, and we cover about the same amount of topic. A lot of the stuff we've done so far outside of this has been sort of chopping things down into very small bits and doing 5 to 15 minute presentations, and that's much better for YouTube. But it doesn't. You need a large series of those to cover even one thing that we're going to be covering in a class like this, or a discussion like this, and this way we get to interact and talk about it. And see you guys.
The unfortunate part about COVID shutting the world down is that we can't interject drills into the discussion as well. So normally we would say, all right, we're going to do this thing, and while we demonstrate it up here and show you the cause and effect, normally that's something in a class we can do with you having a sword in your hand as well, so that you get the practice of understanding both sides of the equation.
Yeah. So basically what we do here, then you have to go and start translating for your own practice as well.
Right. But when the world opens up, you can hit us up for any of these things, and we'll gladly fire hose you with drills to give you some practice things, or just go play out in the list, swing some swords. But are there any questions about wrist cuts which are speedy? Or elbow cuts, which are balanced?
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the main things we looked at, in summation, is sort of the difference in time between when the wrist cuts were happening and the difference in the elbow cuts, and how that the power is translated into distance. One of the big things we looked at with the elbow cuts was taking a step back from our opponent. We weren't engaged fully with our opponent when we're throwing that cut, and that gives us the time and distance to finish that action before our opponent arrives with the thrust. If you're already close and in measure and they can hit you with the thrust, as you're picking the sword up, that's time you lose. But you can take a step back, and all of a sudden now you have the time to finish that cut before they arrive. And that can be very good at inviting your opponent in so that you can slice them away, and create a larger space for you to then throw more cuts, or for you to enter with your body and be safe when you're performing your next action, whether it's a cut or a thrust.
Right. So, carrying the theme of speed as a identifier, if wrist cuts, we said, are at one end of the equation and shoulder cuts are at the other end of the equation, and we said that wrist cuts are fast, but not necessarily as powerful. They're very finessey. That should dictate that shoulder cuts are slow or slower and power. So that's the equation now that we have to balance. You'll see where distance and timing comes into play as well, because these aren't thrown at this range. We don't want to be this close to each other and throwing cuts.
Not for our first engagement, at least.
Right.
Yeah.
But even still, shoulder cuts get more effectiveness.
Yeah, with more space and
with
time.
With more space and time between. So with tonight's class, you'll start to see that progression where we started, very fast, very agile, very fluid, into these are also going to be fluid, but they're going to be slower. You're going to see them a mile away, so you're going to have more time and you're going to have more distance in which you're going to perform these actions. So where are we going to start tonight?
Well, I guess we should start with demonstrating shoulder cuts. What we mean by a shoulder cut.
Sounds good. Yeah, okay. Sounds good.
Let's go get some swords.
What?
Let's get swords.
Yay, longswords.
Okay, so what do we mean by a shoulder cut? And that's sort of the key element here with the mechanics, because I can do a lot of things with my sword from my shoulder, and not all of them are good. So the idea is I'm not actually throwing this wildly swinging blow, right? I'm not throwing all the way around, and actually this wide action is not only very slow, it doesn't control the center of the fight. So what I want to do every time I throw the cut is I want to make sure that I'm cutting forward through the center of the fight. I'm just starting this cut in a place where it's not really my shoulder that's doing the action. It's actually a lot of my hip that's extending my body, and I'm using my whole body behind that blow as I come forwards. And that's kind of the key to a shoulder cut. It's the difference between the elbow cut. If I were to throw an elbow cut with my longsword, I pick the sword up, it's about here, and I throw the elbow cut. I can still put a little bit of hip into that, and I can still step forwards. This is still an elbow cut. With my shoulder cut, I'm bringing it all the way back and then sending it through that line, right? So I'm bringing it up and I'm activating my shoulders, and then I'm sending it out. I can use my step or my hip to support that action, right?
Yeah. So you see a lot of people who will start in the shoulder position and then throw what we call an Oberhau in German, so it just means an overcut. You can also do shoulder cuts from the low line. Germans call it Unterhau.
Unterhau, yeah.
So, but also it starts low, you get actuated, and I'm probably going to hit you because my sword's longer. Just, and when you take the step, it comes up and it's big.
Yeah.
So it can come from below, it can come from above, it can come from the middle.
Yeah.
It can cut in the middle, it can cut low targets, and cut high targets. But it's all in the hip and getting the shoulder and the rotation.
And it's really about how you're sort of wound up for that blow. So again, an action in which I'm doing an elbow cut with an Uterhau.
Yep.
These are an elbow cut, shoulder cut. Right? I'm bringing that all the way back to here before I'm launching that blow. And so now I'm using all of this strength in my muscles, the unification of all this structure in order to be able to put more, I want to say strength into blow, but it's mechanics into it. Look.
I'm sorry. We have
We have a pause for a cat.
There's a feline visitor. We have a new couch in the back and a new cat. And she has discovered if she stands on the back, she can stick her head right into where I would want to cut through long point. So,
right.
sorry about the interruption.
There you go. So we're using those mechanics. One of the things you'll notice about this, we talked about in the elbow cut class, was one of the ways we cut time out of our action is by starting in a position where we're already loaded for that action, right? So most of the time I'm going to be throwing shoulder cuts. I'm not going to be in a forward pointed guard and then be bringing the sword all the way up in order to activate my shoulders and then launching forwards, because now not only am I taking a long time to throw the blow, I'm taking a long time to wind up for the blow. But what I can do is I can be jockeying for position and I can step into a guard in which I've put myself already pre-wound for the ensuing cut, right? So if we're fighting and I come in and I enter into a position now where I've arrived in wide measure and I've assumed the position that I can now throw this cut and I'm wound up and I'm prepared, I can now launch a shoulder cut to enter the fight. The other thing that you'll notice on this that's going to be super important about what we do is I've assumed that guard much wider from my opponent, right? When we looked at wrist cuts, we were already here when we started looking at throwing our wrist cut. When we looked at elbow cuts, we took a step back. Now I'm taking almost an even further step back and preparing myself. And this is a little far.
No, I like being here.
It's a good starting place, but even still, I've now put myself even further back from my opponent, because when I activate my body and when I bring a step to bear with this blow, I'm going to be covering a lot of distance and using a lot of time, and I need to be in that position to do so.
So one of the nice things that when Lot was talking about, you kind of set into when you wanted to throw, is that if he's back that way and I'm back over here, there's a lot of space between us. We have a lot of decision points that we get to make, and we get to like just kind of feel each other out and see what's going to happen and what we're going to do. Neither one of us can hit each other. We are not in a measure where anything, my sword is safe from his. However, if I want to actually start the physical engagement, that's when I'm going to wind into a guard and to be ready. And I may change that, and I may swap positions. But all of that's kind of happening before I get into a position where he can hit me or I can hit him.
Yeah, and that's kind of important about this. So now let's put on masks. Yeah. So let's look at that engagement where I'm way too close in measure, and I'm deciding to throw this cut. And even if I try to assume a guard early, I'm still too close to actually make this cut effective, especially if you're in a point forward position, right? So Panda's going to be assuming what is the German iron gate, or plow, or some other forward pointed position against me, and I'm wanting to enter and throw a shoulder cut against this. If I'm too close, she's got a very easy stab to hit me. There's really not much else, even if I'm in a position already. So I'll throw from the left, that way they can see better. Right? So here we are, I'm in a position, but I'm way too close. Right? I'm close enough that I can, stop. I'm close enough that I can actually hit her, right? This is where this is where I am in my measure. This is the place where I can actually step and cut and hit her. If she doesn't do anything, I can actually step in and strike really nicely. The problem is if I get here and try to do that, my cut is so much slower than her thrust, right? So the only thing I can do from there is really cut at her sword, and even then, it's so much slower. I can cut to the sword, or I can do it without moving my feet, but I'm not really gaining anything because she's just going to move that point and disengage. And now I've entered with a big motion, and I've put myself at risk. So by stepping backwards, I put myself in a position where even if she were to throw that thrust, it's not going to intercept my blow, and my contact point is still going to strike her sword in a way that's going to bring all of my force to bear. So take a step back, I'll take a step back. We're now at a new measure. You can see I'm much further away, and don't do anything. I'm just going to throw my blow. Right? This is the extent of my range. The good thing is if she lets me get there, it's really easy for me to hit her. If she tries to thrust me, I'm still able to knock her sword out of the way. Let's look at it. Same thing. I'll do it on the right side, right? So you're in the same position. You don't do anything, right? And even if you try to counter thrust me, right? You can see the difference is that I'm hitting her sword in two different places. If she doesn't do anything, I'm hitting the middle of her sword. If she does do something, I'm actually still hitting the strong of her sword. But because I'm using the rotational mechanics of the cut, in this case, my blow is stronger because she hasn't supported it against the line of my blow. She's just made a forward thrusting motion. Right?
There's nothing I can do with this. If I do nothing and he takes my sword out of the way, I'm dead before I can react.
Right, and you can see how much space there is for me to step in behind my cut and hit her. Right? Another way to manage this distance isn't just in vertical distance or sort of linear distance between us, but horizontal distance as I enter that space. So one of the things that I can do is instead of stepping straight at her and striking into her sword, I can be a little bit closer and I can step angularly and make the same action to the same place. So again, I'm not striking deep in against her head, because in order to do that with an angular step, I have to be much closer than a linear step. I'm using this step to strike to the sword and claim position in a very, very strong way that's going to give me space and time to fight against it. So we'll look at that. We'll do the same thing. And I'll step, we'll be a little closer, and I'll step to the angle, right?
Pay attention to the physics of what the swords are doing, and we'll come back to that after the situation.
Yeah. So again, if we're in measure, so the measure we're going to be at is if I were to take that linear step forwards, I could threaten her ear, right? And we know that if I throw this strike, she's going to thrust me, and she intercepts my sword, and that's no good for me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make an angled step here and throw the blow in through the center of the fight. All right. So not only have I struck her blade offline, I've moved myself into a position to be even further from her sword, so there's more space and time between me and her, so that then I can strike her in the next action. Right? And even if she tries to counter thrust me in that time, my blow's still going to intercept it, and I'm going to intercept her sword. And I've taken that angular step around it. Right?
So, given that the shoulder cut is slow and it gives her time, what happens if she disengages your shoulder cut?
Right. That's an excellent question. And we're going to get into that. So hold on to that. But conceptually, this is important, right? The importance of how we throw this blow as we enter the fight, and why we're going to throw this blow. Why am I throwing this blow? Because it actually gives me more strength against her defense to throw this heavier cut. I can use the same thing defensively also against my opponent, right? That as my opponent wants to enter either with a thrust or a cut, I'm going to make the same offline stepping motion and strike this time at her through her sword, because I'm going to change the fight on the dynamic axis, on the horizontal axis, as she comes at me. If I don't do that, if I try to just counter strike into her blade by moving straight forwards, I'm going to run into trouble on time, even if I use an elbow cut, right? Just the same way she actually lost on time with a thrust,
Right.
because her thrust is moving after my cut. The cut won't save you either, right? This is a kind of a really important dynamic about how we choose to move with these actions, and why this action forces my opponent to move in this fashion.
One of the points I want to make is, while you guys are watching longswords, these are very slow weapons. They, as a general rule, if you compare a longsword and a rapier together, the rapier is going to move much faster. So the physics that's involved with how the longsword moves is it's slower by its inherent nature. So there's a lot of things that in rapier you'd go, okay, I'm going to make the shoulder cut and then I can do this thing, or I might be able to do a disengage, but physics isn't always going to be on my side. If he gets a good enough hit and sends my blade, or even if I disengage, I may not have enough time in the distance that he's closing to physically move the weapon fast enough to get to where I need to get to.
Right. Because here's the thing, and let's actually answer Todd's question real quick.
Okay.
In this situation, we'll go back to exactly the same situation, and
You want me to disengage?
you're going to disengage.
Okay.
Right? The problem is going to be she can't move forwards.
Right.
Right? So we'll show you that. So all you're going to do is take that and drop the point.
Yeah.
You're going to go through under as I'm cutting at you, right? So here we are, I'm here, I'm in that measure, I cut here. Right? You see what the problem is, Todd? I'm not sure if you can see based on that angle. But she can't move forwards. She could try to thrust me in the flank, but she's going to take it in the face.
Right.
At the same time.
The best I can do is get the bind.
It seems like she could move laterally against your lateral movement.
Yes, she can do that. And that is movement, and that costs and changes time.
Right.
Okay?
But also, I think the thing that I saw you do that was notable is the thing that you've covered in a lot of your like minor classes, which is that the cut to center is not trying to knock the opponent's sword into the next county, it's trying to take the center.
Right, and I don't have to knock it into the next county because all I need to do is throw with my shoulder, and I'm going to get plenty of purchase on that sword. Right? I don't have to do this, right? You notice this is not what I'm doing. Right?
Yeah.
Right? This is great. Are you okay?
Yeah, I said it was gonna hurt.
Yeah. Okay. So I cut all the way through down to here. I knocked her sword out of the way. There's a problem is it's going to take me just as long to bring my sword back as it is for her to bring her sword back. She's going to turn that around and hit me straight in the head. As I do this, it comes and my sword's way back here now. Right? What I'm doing is cutting into the center using my shoulder cut, but not cutting through the center as I enter the fight. Right? I got plenty of purchase on that sword. It's nowhere near my blade, and I've got free access to everything I want. If she's going to do anything in that time, even as I'm throwing that cut, it's going to be a much bigger action. Right? An action in which I can see. And this really actually starts to get into that concept that you were talking about how cuts can be deceiving.
Yeah.
Right? These shoulder cuts really do start to become a function of deception. I want her to move. I want her to parry my sword. I want her to do anything but stand there with her sword in the middle.
Yeah.
Right? Because she's in the middle of the fight and I can't take her out of it. In rapier, what I might do is put my sword next to hers and try to negotiate the space by taking leverage. But if she's going to take that leverage on me, and anything I do to get it back is going to be problematic. The same thing holds true with cutting swords and being able to use these cutting swords. If she's going to take the center, right? So she's taken the center with this point. I have to do something to get the center back. And I can take my sword and put it up against hers and we can play this thrust-oriented game. But I'm losing the benefit of half of my weapon, right? Which is to say, okay, you're going to play in the center. I'm going to change that center and drive you out of it, right? I can just bring all of this to bear and cut you away and finish with my next cut as I enter, right? And anything she does against this has to be much broader than just a simple thrust, right? Because that's the only thing that can defeat me in a single time is a simple thrust. She has to bring this much of her sword to bear against it. And this is where we get concepts like setting off, which is very much like a counter thrust, but brings the whole sword up to cover this line. In fact, we were just talking about this in the chat, Ridderic's chat, last night, that a lot of times in cut and thrust, especially with single-handed swords, let's say rapiers, people have a hard time defending this outside line, especially offhanded, right? So I'm a lefty, and she's a righty, and she's throwing the cut in against me, and if I bring this blade up like I would normally parry, or even do kind of a half parry like I would normally parry, as she reaches forwards with that cut, it's blowing through that whole area, and it's going to blow through my parry. The only way for me to actually parry this sword is to turn the edge against it and lift it to defend my head. Right? And the same thing holds true with a longsword. If I'm in the center and you're throwing the cut from the right, is I turn my blade up against the blow, I cover my head, and I put my point on line. But you notice that the further forwards I put my point, the weaker this is for me, and the worse it is for me. So I need to bring the stable position to the high line to defend that blow, right? Even when that blow is cutting towards the middle of my sword. So let's do this. You do this. I'm just going to throw a good cut and take my blade out. Right? And I pushed forwards, and I tried to thrust her. She knocked it plenty clean out of the way. Ready? Same thing. Right? See how I've lifted the sword in against the blade, and now I've got the opportunity to push my thrust. Right? This is what the Germans call setting off, and it's different than parrying.
Yeah.
It's different than parrying, because what I'm doing is controlling my opponent's weapon in that action. You can see her come to a stop, and I'm in control of her. I can push her around. With a normal parry, she'd still be able to move her sword all over the place, right? And do whatever she wanted to do with it and be completely in control. I might be defended, but I wouldn't be in control.
Right.
And that's a big difference. But you also see sort of the size of action I had to make in order to make that happen. The other promoted defense against a cut is another cut, right? So I can also cut against my opponent's cut, right? And throw a blow. That way now I'm gaining rotational momentum. But again, I need to then be stepping to the side. I need to be making angular actions in order to facilitate the longer time that my cut is going to take. Or if I'm already prepared for a cut, it's going to be faster than a thrust, right? As we established in the first episode. If we're both in point forward positions, and you, or even if you're in a point rearward position in wrath, and I'm in a point forward position just like we were before, and you're going to cut at me, one, I'll make a parry. I'm going to make a simple parry,
Okay.
right? What the Germans would say, don't do.
Of course not.
You make your action, boom. There it is. Pretty good. All right, recover. You do the same thing. I'm going to make a simple parry. So I made a simple parry. I brought my sword to bear. But you see how stable she is, and easily she can move into her next action. And I'm not a threat in any of that time. There was never a time where I turned the tables and I became a threat. So now I'm gonna set off, which is what we just looked at, right? So I become a threat. Right now I become a threat. If she tries to move, she has to deal with my point. And that gives me the advantage, right? The other option I can get is I can take a slice away from her sword, but in order to accommodate this, I'm going to make a step to give me a little more time, especially because I'm in a point-oriented position. I need to bring the sword back before it goes forwards. So you can see at the end of that action, my sword was now in between me and her, and I had a lot more space to access my next action. Or even when I decided to set off, I had a thrust that she could push away, right? So these cuts in responses give us bigger, broader times to respond against our opponent. And because we're throwing a shoulder cut, if I do anything less than one of these two actions, she doesn't have to do anything but keep going. She can keep going with her shoulder cut, and she's still going to be in control of the fight. Even if I block her, she's still stable enough to throw another one, and I'm not in a position to respond. Does that make sense? Because, again, like we go back, if throwing a wrist cut against me in this situation, the only thing she's going to be able to do is take a wrist cut against the tip of my sword, like we did before, is throw a wrist cut to clear the space, right? So we could throw a wrist cut, or you be in the point forward position. Right, she's in plow, and I'm just going to use that wrist cut. I could try to wrist cut, but I got to do that before I move forwards, and so I can't really claim the same type of space to do that. She's still very stable. I'm not as close to her.
There's not as much.
There's not as much purchase on her sword. I could split the difference and throw the elbow cut to enter, right?
Better.
A little bit better. Or I could take the whole thing, and again, I've switched my feet so that I can negotiate space. But even if I was here and I brought my sword up or back into this tog position, this high position, right? Before that. So here we go. And I've come into measure here, and now I'm going to step over here and claim a lot more space and power. Right? Just through this one action. You can see how much further away her sword is, how much more access to the center I have as a result of this cut.
Now, I'll point out that he has put my sword into a good position for me if I want to throw an underhanded cut. But the only way this is going to work for me is if I'm throwing it and getting out of dodge.
Right. The only thing she can do is cut at my sword, because if she throws that going forwards, I'm already in position to defend that. Because I've already cleared that line. Right? If I do this with a weak hand, or if I snap my blade up, or if I pull my sword back after I cut, right? Same type of thing, and I do this, yeah, that's really bad for me. Because I bounced my sword.
I don't have to cut him. All I have to do is get my sword in his way and just poke him.
Because I bounced my sword off of her sword, right? This is why we don't practice bouncing our blade when we cut. What we want to practice when we cut is striking in and claiming that space. Because now, that place that I've sent her, the only place that she can cut back from, I'm already defended from.
Right.
So now she has to step backwards, and I'm okay with that.
And so am I, actually, because now, hey, look, now we have distance. And now we've opened up the fight again, and he's not in a place where he can hurt me quite as easily.
Right.
Am I defended? By distance. And that's a perfectly valid response.
Right.
But as I said, when he knocks my sword, it's already in a guard. Ish.
Yeah.
I'm already in a position that I can do something. But I'm not on the offensive. I'm still defending. I'm still in the war?
No, you're in the
In
knock.
the knock.
Yeah.
So I'm in the defense. Even if I end up hitting his sword, he's still controlling this fight. And the only thing I can do is hope I get enough distance that I can reset and attempt to take the control.
Now, contrarily, if she wants to defend my initial blow, and I'm throwing a wrist cut, and you're going to defend it, you can do that by sticking your strong on it. Okay? So we're back to our initial positions, right? I'm going to be out here because I'm throwing a wrist cut, so I'm just going to do this, right? Before, when you stood static and I did this, well, that was one thing, but now you're going to defend that simply by pushing your strong into it. She just pushes forwards into that counter thrust, and there's not a lot I can do against that. She's defended it. The same with this elbow cut. She's going to make kind of a half parry. Not all the way to Ox, because she doesn't have to go all the way up to defend against this. Right? And she can still get forwards and thrust me. Right? But if I'm going to throw from here, and she does that same parry, right? I'm still covering through that line and suppressing it. In order to defend this, she has to get to a full ox and set me off properly and lift her arms. Now she's defended that, and that's a good defense. But it takes a broader action to defend.
Yeah.
Right? The good thing about this is because she's making a broader action to defend, I can use the distance between us to deceive her. Right? Just like we looked at pulling in our elbow cuts class. I can pull my cut midway through and hit to the opening that I have that's much bigger than even when we were doing those saber parries and we were doing our elbow cuts, because the sword has to move further. So when I do the same thing and I observe that my opponent, as I start to come forwards with my cut, is also at the same time lifting to defend it, I can stop the action, pull it, and strike into the opening where they left. Right? We'll do this with masks on. So now in this case, I've used the action to provoke a large response from my opponent. I've started by stepping wide, but instead of making a full step and finishing this action, I abort that step halfway through. I've now put my right foot where my left foot was, and I'm going to step forward with my left foot in that time of her defense. So instead of stepping and then cutting, I'm aborting and striking from the other side and finishing my cut on the next half of that action.
So one of the reasons that this works is because there are counters for every posture, there are counters for every cut, and as you progress with throwing these, you learn how to read a body. So I know when his shoulder is going to move that the most probable action that he's going to do is he's going to throw that cut. And he's relying on my ability to read his shoulder.
Yeah.
And
no, and if you don't, then I'll just hit you.
He's just going to hit me.
Right.
So he's giving me the clue that says, hey, I'm going to do this thing. And I'm going to go, ha ha, I know the counter to this thing. And he's going to go, ha ha, lied.
Right, I lied. You don't know the counter to this thing.
The rule of thumb is that the shoulders never lie. Your elbows don't lie. But they can change direction. So your shoulder's going to do what you're telling me it's going to do, but you can change that direction before I have a chance to react to it.
Right.
Or if I do react to it, I'm going to be slow, out of measure, and more than likely dead.
And this is what the Germans talk about when they talk about the vor, or the before. They say, seize the vor, seize the before, which means seizing the initiative of forcing your opponent to predictably respond to your action. I'm going to throw this cut because my opponent has a limited number of responses that they can do, and I can be watching those responses. I can tell the difference between whether my opponent is going to set me off with the counter thrust or is going to try to slice me away with a cut based off of the initial motion of their sword. Because if they're going to cut, the sword has to come back first.
Right.
Right? So I can be watching for that when I make this action. And I know that I have a number of different counters, both against the thrust and against a cut. This is one of the fun things, too, the response that Meyer makes about running off.
Right.
Right? Is that I don't just have to pull my cut, which is, again, also a predictable motion that she might be looking for. I can turn my sword as it goes and avoid her blade completely and get closer with my footstep than I would with pulling, counting on the fact that her blade is in the middle of a cut, and because it isn't going to hit a target, it's not going to stop very easily, or it's definitely going to go further than my opponent wants it to go. right? So let's look at that.
Okay.
The motion I'm going to make in this action is, instead of trying to pull my hands backwards or stop my hands as they go forwards, I'm going to continue my hands forwards, but instead of striking at the same angle, I'm going to rotate them out, and you can see this arc my point makes when I rotate my hands. That arc is going to go around my opponent's hands as they come, and blade really, as they come through that line. So you're going to make a counter cut against my weapon, right?
My counter.
Downward.
From here?
Yeah, just start in Iron Gate and just,
Pick it up and hit it.
yeah,
Okay.
right? She's cut me off. She's gained really good space time, and she can use an angled step with that to give you more time to accomplish it. Right? Really good for her. This is a great defense. What I'm going to do is turn my sword so it doesn't actually connect with her sword.
That doesn't go well for me.
And if we slow that down, what I did was I turned my hands this way and came out under her sword instead of pulling my sword back and around. So we'll do it really slowly. Here's the initial cut. She lifts her sword. She comes in with the other cut. I'm trying to place my feet. I've rotated my hands this direction. And as she continues with the cut, it misses me completely. And it's going that way. Keep your line. Oh, piggy, piggy. Ready? Nice and slowly. I come in this way. You lift, and I turn here. So, it's one of these motions that starts a shoulder cut and kind of ends as a wrist cut. But instead of trying to pull the sword back directly and step around the space, I'm actually stepping into the space fully with my right foot, but I'm avoiding her sword with mine, and because there's no contact, her blade keeps going. It keeps looking for that contact, right? Even if she pauses, even if she just cuts to the center, just by pulling that rug out a little bit will freeze her in the position, and I'm already moving to the next side. I'm already half a step ahead of her. And I've done that by seizing the initiative with my cut and gaining a predictable response, which she can cut me from any direction, and I can use this technique against it. It doesn't really matter. But I can see that she's cutting because she's picking her sword up to do it.
Because it can't cut from there. I have no purchase.
Right, you can't, your sword's already forward, so there's no cut.
Right, it's just thrust.
Right.
So what's super important with these is that I have to buy the lie that Lot tells me.
But you don't have, like, if you don't, I don't do it.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's if you're going to feint, one of the things to practice is selling the lie.
Yeah.
Because if I don't buy it, then you could feint and I've already countered. Or you can attempt to feint, but if you're not necessarily committed or your movement changes,
Yeah.
then I don't buy the lie.
Right.
So a lot of times the feints work because you've, as Lot said, he picked his foot up enough to give me the indication that he's going to move, but not fully enough to commit to a cut.
Right.
He didn't just kind of make the motion with the heel. There's actual movement with the foot, and the fencer on the other side of that lie is looking at the entire body. We're not just reading a shoulder. We're not just reading a head. If we're doing our job correctly as a fencer, we have to look at the whole body, and his foot usually will sell it.
Correct.
But
I need to make sure I'm not moving it all the way into measure.
Because then you commit to
Because
it.
I've committed, then I can't feint.
Then you can't
Yeah.
complete the lie. You have to complete, well,
Right.
You're completing the action.
I'm completing the action. I have to tell you enough of the action to say, this is where I'm going to go, and I have to be ready to follow through if you don't do anything.
Right.
But if I just do this,
it's noise I'm going to ignore.
right, you're going to ignore that. I have to give you the look of,
right.
Hey, I'm coming forward.
So it's right there where he picked his foot up just enough to move it, but not enough to commit to it. And that's where it gets tricky. You know, feints are they're deceptive and they're beautiful. But you have to sell the lie. You have to get your opponent to buy the lie. Which, you know, when he just throws from the shoulder, I'm usually out of measure going, okay, are we done? Okay, what's the actual action that's going to happen? And sometimes I'm going to make a lot of noise and then hit you in the head because you're complacent about what I'm going to do. That's kind of a valid technique. Not a great one, but valid.
That's fair. So there's some more to talk about too, but I want to kind of like field some questions.
So I'm clearly not the best at this. This is all things that I am learning just watching you guys. So this won't seem like a silly question, but the whole bounce back, like I super fixated on that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever actually a reason why that would be done, or is it just like poor reflex? Not poor reflex, just a habit of like something hits you bounce back, and that's just something that the body might naturally want to do.
If you're practicing against a static target that is soft and rubbery,
like a pell
or foamy covered in duct tape.
Yep.
In fact, let's grab the pell. I can show this. You want to show?
Yeah,
me
you can.
Oh,
I'm
I'll
going to
do
sit
that
for
in
half a second.
But
She's gonna sit. You can get
well, you can do it. But
we can all do it.
Right. If you're practicing on something like a pal that is rubbery or foamy, and if you're practicing with a simulator that is sometimes blunt and sometimes maybe plastic, sometimes maybe bendy straw,
whippy,
something that is whippy, you are going to get a natural feedback that will want to encourage you to bounce.
Right.
And if you're especially like you're throwing your cut in a way in which you're not crossing the line with your hands as you cut, which is something we've talked about in all of these cuts, is sending your hand across the line and making sure you create this diagonal angle with your blade as you connect into target. If you're not doing that, if your hands are on the same side of the target as your blade and you're kind of hyperextending, you're going to feel those natural bounce backs.
Right.
When you do this against a sword, it does not give you those same things.
No.
And if you do this against your opponent, one, you actually hurt them more than if you were to stabilize yourself behind your sword and not bounce off of them.
Right.
So that the more you try to stop your sword as it hits the target and pull it back by pulling back on it, the more likely you are to whip your point into somebody and strike them with more force than you intended.
Yeah, you end up with whips and rather than swords.
And all of those things can be bad when you're throwing against a blade, which is going to get dynamically knocked out of the way.
Right.
During the course of the fight, which is the goal. The whole goal.
Because physics.
Yeah.
We don't get to escape physics ever in swordplay. But I think one of the other things that's super important to note is that sometimes the bouncing is a really bad habit carryover from rapier, where it's like keep your blade moving, keep it moving, keep it moving, keep your arm moving, keep trying to confuse your opponent on the other end.
Yeah, and it's that sort of snapping the hand. Snapping the hand, right?
And so you take those habits with you into cotton thrust, and some people take it even with the longsword, is they will keep it moving, keep it moving, keep it moving, and you get that bouncing sort of action. And then we try and it looks like fly fishing.
Yeah.
When you see it on the list, is this you see it in rattan a lot when they fight.
I was trying not to say that, but
you know what, I'll own it.
Yeah.
Because I fought rattan longsword.
Me too.
But they fly fish, It's a snap, 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 snap.
And it's
snap,
and a
snap.
bounce.
A
And a
bounce,
bounce. Yeah, a
boink,
bounce.
boink, boink, boink. So you end up boinking. And you actually, it ends up hurting your shoulder. It can end up hurting your opponent.
Yeah.
But
it's also a habit from striking and then pulling back into the guard you just struck from.
right,
Right? If you're practicing the same blow over and over again,
Right.
and you're doing this,
which is why we recommend changing
right?
lines.
Right, which is why we recommend changing lines. But if you're practicing the same cut and
Yeah.
going boop, boop, boop,
Now you're
boop,
fishing.
now you're training this response of touch back, touch back, touch back. And so even were you to cut into the line properly through the sword, but then pull back into the guard you just left, you've now opened that. You remember Panda was standing in that guard ready to strike up from below. And if I strike and then pull back, I've just exposed the line that I've worked so hard to gain.
Yeah, you're either dead or you just gave up what you just got.
Exactly.
Well, in that case, he
Or
would
both.
be dead.
Or both.
Yeah. Or in that case, you pull.
or dead because I gave up what I just
Right.
got. Right.
Right,
yeah.
because again, physics knocks my
Right.
sword into. I mean, it's not an ideal change. It's a little bit.
No. I mean, and there's a
but-
moment of recovery.
Right,
That
so-
gives me time.
Right. So, in that moment where my sword is now in a guard, I still have to either remember I'm in a guard and I can do something with it. He still has to recover to do an action, and so if I get out of dodge, now we have distance and time again. If I stay in dodge and I try and throw the blow that I'm like, aha, I'm in the right position for, and he throws his blow, the chances of me being dead first are probable. At worst, we double kill. And I say at worst because defense is a thing we should
Right.
do in sword play.
Um,
It's not good to try to head
and
nobody.
and sort of by that same token, right? An advanced fencer with cutting, it can put their sword in a position to get struck. I can invite my opponent to come attack my sword and give them enough pressure to make them think they're successful in their action, when really that they've moved me out of the way, when really I've moved me out of the way. In fact, we didn't do that one. There's a really great example of this in Fiore,
Okay.
which is an Italian text or a Friulian text, but he talks about studying with the Germans. So you all the Hema people can debate whether he's true Italian or not. But
Isn't that purchase?
I don't. It's
Southern
Fiore,
German?
right? Yeah, sure. It's Fiore. You know what Master Fiore taught, right? He has a very I would say classic. It's it's one of the things that everybody learns when you study Fiore. It is principal to his action is an action called the peasant's strike, the villain's strike.
Yep.
Kind of assuming that a peasant or a villain, someone who is untrained in swordsmanship, but has their hands on a sword and is going to come at you, is going to throw a shoulder cut. They've picked up a sword and they want to attack you, which means they're probably mad at you for some reason. Like if they're not trained in fencing, right, they're going to throw a big cut at you. They're going to throw that shoulder cut, and they're going to expect feedback.
Right.
Right? And so what Fiore does is he actually gives them the sword to hit while moving out from underneath the sword, so that as they push through that strike, going, blam, right? The peasant is actually giving you the space and the time that's going to provide you for your strike after that.
Right. Right.
And because they're not so aware on tempo, you can really take advantage of this type of thing.
Do I get to be the villager?
You want to be an villager?
I could totally be the villager. Watch me be angry, hit you with a sword. Sound effects.
So while you're getting ready, essentially what I'm going to do in this action is, as she's coming at me with this big downward strike, she's mad, she's coming at me, she's throwing that sword at me. I'm going to starting in an exposed head position so that she strikes at my head. I'm going to put my sword in the way. I'm going to catch her sword on the weak part of mine so that it feels really good for her. But while I do that, I'm actually going to step to my left. Now as she pushes through that contact point instead of her forcing me out of the way, I'm going to actually lift my hands. Very similarly to the way I just did with Myers running off. Right? I'm going to lift my hands, and my sword is going to stay between me and her the whole time. And once she's fallen off my sword and past me, then I will step to her side and strike her in the head, where she has no defense.
As I said, this is going to go poorly for me. Taxes.
Right? We slow that down. So I kept it here. But you notice that even if I wasn't in this position, she's not going to hit me anyway. I've already moved out of the way of the sword, right? So this is just a distraction. Do the same cut. I'm stepping here. This is just a distraction. Do it again. We come in.
So is that crossing step that you're doing? Because normally, particularly in rapier, you preach, depending on the circumstances, but usually, at least at the beginning, you don't cross your legs.
Yeah.
But that was definitely an intent. That's what it looked like from the angle.
Yeah.
So was that done with what was the intent, or is it just the flow of the longsword? Because I've played with the double-handed, and I noticed that it's kind of like a waddling movement, like circular side-to-side kind of thing. I can't describe it well, but...
Right. One is you've been lied to.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to teach that to someone in 101, but...
No. You've been taught a Victorian rule that has been carved now into stone, and you're not allowed to bend it. And it's wrong. We cross our feet all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And in historical fencing, we cross our feet all the time. But we do it in balance, and we do it with intent. So one of the things to think about is, we say this, whichever direction I'm moving, that foot moves first. So if I move forwards, my front foot moves first. What happens if I'm moving diagonally forwards?
Yeah. I mean,
Right?
That makes sense, particularly because you're going to the left, because it's a lot more effort to pull that back foot all the way forward.
Right. This is
move
so
to
much
that
slower.
diagonal left foot. Yeah.
And now watch also where my body actually goes when I do that. Now watch what happens when I do this.
It looks like you close yourself a lot more off when
Mm-hmm.
you lead with your
I
right.
actually avoid the strike this way.
Mm-hmm.
If this is the downward strike, and I step this direction, I'm actually avoiding it. If I step this direction, I'm not. I'm still getting
Yeah, your
hit.
right side is still exposed.
Because this hasn't moved any, right? So one thing is, what I'm not doing is this, right? I'm not twisting my feet up
Right.
so that I can't address my opponent, right? But I will tell you this. Historically, when you look at movement diagrams, both Spanish, German, Italian, this is an incredibly common step for a lot of different reasons, right?
But doesn't that look like a modern demi-void?
Yeah, it's absolutely a demi-void, and I'm crossing my feet around behind myself.
So we have the concept of it modernly, too.
Right. And this is just a slope pace, right?
Right.
And I can step that direction, and I can do all of these actions, and I can cross my feet wherever I want to, because I'm in balance as I do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I can just walk.
Yep.
And there's no reason why these steps are invalid. They're just done for specific reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
If all I do is this at my opponent, you see that my sword's no longer. As soon as I do this, my sword's no longer protecting me. and I'm not really changing the line. But when I do this, I can actually create dynamic movement and stay in balance as I do every action. Because even here, I know that my body is triangulated into my feet. Right? It's when I'm doing this that's a problem. Right? But even still, I could do this and be in balance.
But you've changed how your feet are positioned.
Right.
You've changed.
You notice that the feet are in the same spot, but I've changed my whole body to accommodate that balance point. So it's not about necessarily crossing your feet. It's about how you're stepping, staying on the balls of your feet, so that you can make dynamic rotation actions that can change your hips and alignment within the fight.
That looks a lot like salsa with a sword.
What? Looks like dancing?
Looks like salsa with a sword. What?
It's amazing that like
salsa has helped me an awful lot because of that. Because I used to salsa dance.
Yeah, me too.
Me three.
But historical masters were also dance teachers.
Yep.
Turns out.
Turns out. Someone keeps trying to get me to do dance lessons. Something about my fencing will get better when I learn how to be a little more light on my feet.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
the hip movements. The hip movement is really what helped me loosen up my hips. And I did salsa dancing before I started fencing, and I found it incredibly helpful. Once it triggered, and I was like, oh, I just need to rotate them like this.
Yeah.
Right.
So we have a. Didn't we talk about doing a footwork class later? Like next series of episodes?
Maybe. I guess we're going to do a footwork class.
We're going to do footwork class.
It's
I
all,
love footwork.
You know, a lot of that's all embedded in kind of what we're doing now anyway. If you look at kind of how we're describing this footwork, and you look at the fundamentals of the mechanics that we're using, you'll transpose all of that into footsteps. If realistically, again, it's not about the step you make. It's about the angle that you make. It's about aligning your body into the action.
Well, it's also that remaining in balance. Small step, big steps. There's a whole lot involved into it.
Yeah.
Especially so with shoulder cuts and balance. Because you're throwing with more power, it's very easy to throw yourself out of balance when you're fighting. So knowing how the cuts are thrown.
Don't fling this thing for the fences.
Yeah.
That's not a shoulder cut.
You don't need to.
You don't need to. That's
we don't want to
that's
hit people that hard either. But taking a smaller step sometimes better than taking a big step.
Almost always. Well, that's not true.
No, I said sometimes.
No. I just contradicted myself.
I was waiting for it.
Meyer's very clear that sometimes you take small steps, sometimes you take big steps.
Right.
And I'm absolutely on board with that.
And the important part is remaining in balance no matter what step you take.
Yeah. My harp is that people take too big of a step for their body, and then they're kind of leaning weird as they step.
Well, when you're out of balance, your sword is out of balance too when you throw the bigger cuts.
Yeah.
It's easier to be slightly off balance with doing the wrist cuts because the cuts aren't as big and they don't have as much momentum being carried. If you're out of balance and you're throwing a shoulder cut, you're going to be more out of balance by the time you get through the cut. If you're throwing a full extended cut at your opponent.
Right.
That absolutely makes sense to me.
Right. And if we go back, let's go back to kind of the original premise of mechanics for these cuts. One of the things we've kind of talked about, definitely in the other videos that we've pointed people to, is we're not making a long Victorian style lunge with our feet when we make this action. And so because of that, like your footwork becomes so much more natural, in my mind, to kind of both how we dance
Yeah.
and how we actually kind of tend to move as people.
Right.
You know, and when your legs are safer. That's kind of the I'm gonna show that too. So just
What are we doing?
like I want to make sure I have space. So the idea is when I'm throwing this cut, I'm not making this. You see that deep leg step, but my body's upright, and yeah, I'm in balance linearly and downward, but I'm actually not in balance kind of this way, and I'm not behind my sword, so that I've driven the power out of my sword so it can't actually follow through very easily. It's the line and or defend me from the line I'm actually trying to take by stepping out and leaning behind my sword with a smaller step. I can get my body out and stay behind my sword, and then when I make those full cuts, I can actually drive into them if I want to. But now I'm safe through my action. Whereas if I'm out here, I'm actually not safe in my cut, and certainly my leg is not safe.
Would you be able to show that from the different angle? Only because like we saw your body and your feet on that one, but when you're like, well, my sword isn't doing this, I have a very Right.
So facing forwards, right, and I step and I throw a good diagonal cut, right? I'm not sure kind of for your depth, that's why I did it horizontally, right? My leg is exposed because it's out in front and I'm not defended in my cut. And if I try to keep going through this cut, it doesn't cut through. It stops here, and you can see my point stops high, which is where I want my point to stop, but I want it to stop high here so that I'm actually defended behind my sword, and I can bring my weight to bear through that cut and smother things down towards the ground if I want to. Does that make sense? So when I say take big steps and small steps, these are the steps I mean, right? Small step, big step.
Oh yeah.
Right?
That's a lot of time of recovery too, as your back foot just keeps.
But it's right. But even still, it's better than this step because there is no recovery from this step.
No.
If I take this step, my recovery is to do this, right? I can just keep going. I can just keep moving because I'm in a place where I can access all of the joints and muscles and keep my sword in front of me. But when I do this, right, you get stuck right in that position. And then you have to bring your sword back. And again, that's what we're talking about when we're cutting of you're my target with your sword. Target with your sword. When I make these cuts and I practice this cut, and I cut out into this space, the last thing I want to do is come back to where I started from.
Yeah.
Right? What I really want to do is then throw another cut from a different line. Right? Or throw a thrust that my opponent may respond to by knocking it out of the way, and then I throw another cut.
So the one thing I wanted to demonstrate, because Lot really can't do this, because Lot's beating it out of the system. I want to show you what it looks like when you take the big step and you try to finish the cut. Because you get that nice stopping.
Yeah. All right.
I want you to see how awful this actually is.
Don't hurt yourself.
I won't. But we see a lot of people do this because, again, they're thinking that in order to hit their opponent, because they're at distance, they have to lunge. And when lunging with a longsword is really not a great idea. So, again, we're getting that nice good guard. Gonna throw the cut. With that full extension.
Oof.
I can do nothing from here except die.
But
Yeah,
you still have a lean, right? What I'm talking about is that big fencer step with the
big fencer.
upright
We can do the
torso, right?
Big fencer step.
Right? Yeah.
So even with the lean, where I start nice balance
Right.
thing, if I get way extended past where I'm going to go, you can see the only place I was going to go is dead.
Right.
Let's see if I can do the fencer.
Right. That's what I was demonstrating.
Okay.
Which
Fencer lunge.
both
Ready?
of them are
Awful.
different things, right? Yeah. Yeah. You have the hips to lean.
I do have the hips to lean,
Yeah.
but even if I do this, now my sword is hit
Yeah.
the ground and bounce back up.
You also can't land on your heels.
That's okay.
No, yeah, I mean that's bad. Like your
Yeah.
feet are not constructed, and that's the big tell in this step, is that when I do this step and I kick that foot out and I land,
yeah.
this is that front toe kick land step, right?
Right.
This requires that my torso be upright when I finish. The problem with this is there's no way to finish a cut in this step, and I have plenty of other videos that describe why I don't lunge this way.
Right.
So I won't spend too much time on it.
Right,
More than I already
but even if you were to attempt to try and finish the lunge, you end up bent over in half. Your sword's either in the ground, so far behind you, you're just dead.
Right. Yeah. That's like for me. That would be like that.
And possibly blowing out your knee.
Yeah.
Oof.
You don't have to do any of that. Like that's the thing about these cuts, is they cover so much diagonal territory defensively that you don't have to rush to your opponent.
Right.
Right? Like Todd said, what happens if they disengage, right? It doesn't matter to me because I'm putting my sword out through there. The amount of motion they have to make to get around my sword is big. It's
significant.
It's significant. It's not like disengaging a rapier, right?
Right.
And these don't move fast.
Yeah, and so the bigger responses give me the bigger time to fit my next action into it. And the larger step I'm making, the more I have to throw my foot forwards, the harder it is for me to stop and change. And what I really want to be able to do is stop and change and keep these actions moving in a way that I'm giving you a big cut because I want you to have to respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I want you to respond to it. That's what I'm it's not that I'm counting on it, because if you don't, I'll hit you. But I'm forcing you to do it.
Right.
I'm forcing you to make a big response against my action.
Right.
And that response is what's going to allow me to hit you later.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not about one shot, one kill. These
Right.
are not sniper rifles. The art of fencing is in the process of getting to your opponent and leading them down a path that ultimately you will win.
Right. You're playing chess.
Right.
Yeah.
And the nice thing we were illustrating tonight have been with the longswords. But as you can see, I have told you that the weapon is slow, and it is because it has a lot of mass, and they're weighty. But you can also see that they move quickly, given their size and their weight. And once momentum is traveling on their side, you just use the momentum to your advantage to carry it through to either the next cut or into your opponent or whatever is going to happen. Which is why I love the shoulder cuts, is they're very aggressive. But when they're executed correctly, they're also very fluid. They're very smooth, even though they're big. And I think the thing that's for me the big takeaway with the shoulder cuts is that distance is your friend. You don't want to play in really close range with shoulder cuts until you do. But and sometimes getting out of distance to regain composure or to start a new exchange is the correct course of action, rather than just starting your program, working your way down the program, getting stopped in there, and then continuing with what you had written as the next line of your program.
You mean being adaptable or resetting, getting out of dodge?
Yeah, being flexible, resetting, resetting your bout, and ending one exchange and starting a new exchange. The other I guess tidbit I want to bring in is that these shoulder cuts, you'll see them with like the single-handed weapons as well. So with like a messer or a falchion or any of those kinds of things, which are also beefier weapons. I mean, they're single-handed, so they're meant to be used in your hand, but they will have some of the same limitation of weight and how they move.
Because they're maximized for broader actions, right?
Right.
They want the strength of the weapon and the strength of the body to control space and your opponent. Which a rapier isn't doing that. A rapier is using angulation and narrow action to control that space, and using smaller and smaller actions in order to control that space instead of using driving actions to create bigger space. And in order to do that, having a bigger, heavier weapon actually is more advantageous to you.
Right. So
how much does the second hand of leverage drive that? It seems like, I mean, a longsword should, can be faster than a rapier because you have two hands to lever it. Whereas it feels like with a single-handed weapon, when you're making a shoulder cut, like with a heavy single-handed weapon, it feels like you have less maneuverability to change the line of the weapon because you don't have that second-handed leverage.
It depends.
It depends, like here, let's grab messers real quick.
Okay.
Ooh, masters. Hat.
Do you want masters?
Do I need a mask?
Probably. Let's do the same thing. Let's just do the same kind of drill.
Which one?
That entry cut that we're looking at.
The one where I'm the angry villager, or just
the
wrath?
The cut against a forward dart.
I mean, could you still pretend to be an angry villager? Because I thoroughly enjoyed that.
Yeah, she's a smarter fencer right now, so.
So what you're saying
this
is
time
I
I've slept with your sister. What?
What?
I don't know. I slept with your sister this time. Is that what you're mad at me for? Something much more high class than angry villager.
You insulted my tie.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Great. All right.
Okay.
You
So
insulted
again.
my tie. Roar.
Right. Again, you'll notice I'm going to start in a pre-charged position in order to cut the tempo as I launch my initial attack. So I can be closer because the blades are shorter.
You just make a very satisfying team.
Yep.
Like if we apply the lesson from before, it seems like her ox is going to be weaker with only one hand, but your ability to maneuver around her ox is going to be a little slower with only one hand.
Why don't we show ox?
Okay. Yeah. You want to do ox?
I'll do ox.
You're not wearing a glove.
Watch me fix that problem.
Mm-hmm.
Tonight's all about playing with the weapons I like playing with. It's great.
I don't know how long we've actually been running, so.
We're okay. We got started late.
Yeah. So now again, if she tries to counter thrust, just the straight thrust. Mm-hmm. Right? Notice I can bring that shoulder cut to bear just the same way. My blade stops, my point's in line. Even if she tries to move,
What am I doing?
just avoid, just pull your sword away so I don't hit it. Right? I go a little bit past, but because I'm throwing with the proper mechanics, because I'm throwing out and not down, I don't go past where I want my blow to go. Right? So when she turns to ox, it's the same thing, is that it's all in the alignment of the body, not in the movement of the hand. The hand is just guided by the shoulder. It's just lifting, and it's the support mechanism underneath the weapon which is the exact same support mechanism you use with two hands that makes it just as fast.
So there, she stepped laterally.
Yeah, you don't do it without stepping laterally.
I'm just curious to see what happens if you don't step laterally. Okay.
Right? She just turned her hand. It's this motion supported by the shoulder. If she does it trying to move her wrist, what happens is the blade lifts this way. Right? And I just was been harping about not doing that.
I was gonna say, and then the Maestro gets mad at me, and
Right.
we end up doing more cuts.
Because this is what happens. You want to show it?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Wait, am I doing a wrist?
Yeah, you want me? Here, you can do
No,
it.
no,
I'll do it wrong. I don't want you to do it wrong anymore. I'll do it wrong. You're throwing the wrath cut.
Turn around. Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, that's what happens when I do this. Right? But when I support that action with my arm and my shoulder, and I lift my hand and not try to just use my wrist to send the blade away.
Got it. So if you try to parry in fourth, you get your sword knocked out.
Right. Well, so if I try to parry in fourth, my sword doesn't get knocked out. She just keeps hitting me in the head. Same thing, ready? Right? It doesn't stop her. Fourth isn't going to stop her unless I bring my strong to her point. Right? That's the problem, is do it really slowly and stop at the moment of impact. Stop. Okay, so here's the moment of impact, and I'm in fourth. Right? And if I go further forwards, again, I'm still strong, I'm still on her strong because of the nature of the arcing motion of the point. In order to defeat her in fourth, I have to get my strong to her point, which means, same thing, moving my fourth to a higher position, which looks like ox. Right? Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. So that's what necessitates the larger defense, is that I can't defend it here because the nature of this cut is going to power through
Right.
anything that the strong hits, and the weak leverages past. Right? So in order to defeat this cut, and you see this in Rapier all the time, they say send your strong. You know, you defeat in Rapier, you defeat it in fourth, but you defeat it by getting your strong on their cut, because we don't just defeat it in fourth, we defeat it in fourth, right? And you can see that my strong is in the way of the cut, right? As opposed to here where it isn't.
Right.
So I could do this, but I don't have time to lunge into my opponent in this case.
Right.
Because my body isn't withdrawn enough that I can fit it into that space. I'm much more forwards, so I have to make a broader action. And the reason why I'm not fighting from back here is it defeats the purpose of a cutting weapon. It takes all of this out of play. So now I have all of the access to my defenses and can turn those into strokes.
And
Right? And I can bring the blade, which is heavy and strong,
right.
I can use it to its maximum efficiency.
It's important to remember that these weapons are not rapiers. Can we use them one-handed? Sure. Like, you can use a longsword one-handed. It's really dumb, but you can. And in the SCA rules, it allows you to use a two-handed weapon with one hand. But you lose all of the advantage of how the weapon is designed. Same with, like, using the messers as a rapier. Can it be done? Sure. It's not a really good use of a messer. It's not what it's designed to do. It's a cutting weapon. It wants to cut. And even some rapiers, the way that they're designed, are they rapiers? Sure. But sometimes you pick up a rapier and you're like, this is a cutter. It wants to cut. Will it thrust? Sure. But by the how the blade is designed, how the guard is designed, the balance and the weight of the weapon itself, you can pick up a thrusting weapon and you can pick up a cutting weapon. They will both each do the other thing, but there are purposes for which they are designed and will do much better with.
And I will say this, two things. I'll say two things on exactly that. Is that one, if you look back at the previous two videos in which I did rapier, I was using the same hilt, but I had swapped out blades.
Right.
Because we were doing wrist cuts in the first episode, and I was using a rapier blade, a baited rapier blade. I had switched to a heavier, I believe it was the Spada-sized blade,
Right.
For the German rapier, because I was doing elbow cuts. And that blade is much better balanced and designed to do more cuts with than my other. Can I do cuts with the other blade, the other rapier blade? Sure, I do it all the time.
Right.
And I fight German rapier with a baited rapier blade all the time. But in this case, I was going for the sort of the blade that really fit the design of what I was talking about.
Right.
And also, you'll see this. This is where causation and correlation start to get wobbly. There are people who are so very good with thrusts
Right.
that they can use any weapon and defeat another opponent who is using the weapon to their maximum efficiency.
Right.
Or at the very least, that the person who they are fighting is not trained well enough against a principal cutter or a principal thruster
Right.
To engage with this person's excellence of skill. And I've seen it from a number of different really, really top-level fencers where they go in and they use a longsword from plow and do thrust-oriented fencing.
Right.
But you'll notice that their measure is much wider, and they're doing, they're using a lot of those disengages and just counter-thrusting.
Right.
And Meyer has a lot to say about people who do that, but we don't train against it as much.
Right.
So you get people who aren't trained against somebody standing in plow and what Meyer would call straight parrying. And so they're trying to throw these broad cuts instead of expecting a cut to come back in return when that's not what they're fighting. They're fighting a thrust, and they should be pounding that sword into the ground
Right.
instead of trying to attack their opponent.
Right.
So, I see it a lot, and I've fought a lot of people who've tried this against me, and I have my way of approaching it. I'm not the world's best longsword fighter, I will admit to that, but by the same token, like I've seen a lot of people fall victim to what are very, very simple basic thrusts because they're expecting their opponent to be countercutting.
Right.
And that's their fault. That's the fault of the person who isn't actually fighting the fight that's in front of them.
Right. And and it is okay for us to be rapier fighters fighting with longswords and remembering we know how to thrust. It's a very valid technique, especially with some longsword fighters that fight like this and they leave their elbows out. Just stab it. And it's valid. Is it pretty? No, not always, but it's effective. It's the discipline is called cut and thrust.
Right.
It's both parts. And sometimes, especially when I was first learning C&T and learning the cuts because they had been beaten out of me, I forgot that I could thrust. And I thought I forgot that I could counter against thrusts because other people would be thrusting at me because I'm like, I am learning cuts. I must do the cutting and doing the thing. But, understanding the cut mechanics and understanding the thrust mechanics helps you understand when and where to use and counter.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Along those lines, it did look like regarding fighting someone who wants to thrust with a longsword, it looks like the advantage that the person making the cut has is by choosing the angle of their step. They are controlling the tempo of their opponent's opportunity to thrust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Like if you're stepping directly toward your opponent, if you miss with your cut, then they can be thrusting in the same tempo of your step forward. But if you're stepping laterally, you're not necessarily gaining the distance they need you to gain in order to hit you with simultaneous thrust, and you're able to sweep your wrath cut is going to sweep better.
Right, but I think that those are the same. That's the same sort of thing you need to be thinking of if you're using a rapier as well. That the technique that you're talking about isn't just exclusive to some of these larger weapons or heavier weapons, or the bigger cuts. They are, lateral movements, diagonal movements, lateral movements backwards. Using the full range rather than that forward and backward sort of footwork patterns that we generally see a lot of in the SCA. It's beneficial if you're fighting rapier as well. If you're fighting mixed weapons, which generally doesn't happen much in Qaid, you generally do not see longswords fighting against rapiers. It becomes even more important because now you're talking about a difference in mass and a difference in preferred method of killing, so to speak.
Yeah, and one of the other things to sort of understand with somebody who's playing that game is that you want them to lunge at you, right? Part of what you're doing is trying to entice them to lunge at you from a very long distance, because the longer the distance, the more response time you're going to have against it. And what you can do is throw your cut as they're entering at you, as opposed to trying to throw your cut at them. Like if I'm a longsword fighter fighting against a rapier fighter, most of what I'm going to do in wide measure is going to try to entice my opponent to lunge. Mm-hmm. And if they're not going to do that, then I'm actually going to bind and crowd their sword as much as I can, right. Which will put me in a position where they have to push. Right. And that's not something that's something I definitely want to get into at some point. Is that, and we'll definitely look at this next week for sure too, more of next time, right? Is that once I've established space, whether it's through that cut or some other fashion, and I have the advantage and my opponent now has to make an even wider action to defend me, they have to push my sword out of the center.
Right.
And that gives me all the time in the world to throw a shoulder cut from the other direction.
Yeah. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that when we talked about wrist cuts, we talked about stealing time. That you have the ability to steal time from your opponent through distance. And I think with shoulder cuts, you're creating time with your distance, that you can actually create the illusion of time, that you have more because of the distance, or even giving yourself more distance between you and your opponent.
Yeah, through your angular action.
Yeah.
Right. Your angular action is leading you to create more space from their weapon.
Right.
Right. Absolutely.
Which gives you time to either change what you're doing or do a feint or.
Right. And it keeps you further away from them. Like,
right.
Do you want here? Let's even do single hand. I've got your rapier. You want to be a rapier?
Not really, but okay.
Okay. Yeah. That's okay. Do it.
Do it anyway, he says.
I'm going to be using a messer, not a longsword. So we're single-handed.
But we're still single-handed, and his weapon still has more mass than mine does.
Right, so her goal is to stick that in between us and keep me at the other end of it. Right? So she's done this. I've got this weapon. The fallacy here is that if I swing at this sword, she's gonna She's just gonna disengage, right?
Yeah.
So I swing at the sword, she disengages and thrusts, right? And that's the fallacy. That's a really bad move on my part. I've got the big swingy weapon, so I'm gonna swing it at her, right? And all she has to do is disengage and thrust me, and that's great. Except for what have I done is I've used space and time to no advantage. Right? Because I'm creating this swath, she still has a sort of a broader action that she's going to make, and I still want her to step at me, right? So I'm going to make that same action, but instead of just swinging indiscriminately at her sword, I'm going to use space and time to my advantage, right? Now what happened? She made exactly the same step in the same time, and she hasn't hit me yet. She can't hit me in that time. She still needs more distance. Because what did I do? I didn't just step indiscriminately forwards. I stepped to the side and created a new angle that brought me a little closer, so that if she didn't do anything, I would take her sword out of the way, and now I would have access to the center, right?
This is going to take me a really long time. I'm not going to get back.
Right. You probably have to throw a cut or something like that. But even still, I've done exactly what I've wanted to do. But what I've also done is put myself in a position so that when she does disengage, she's not close enough to hit me.
Not even if I lunge.
Right. So we're here. Notice I've changed my distance, and I come to, and now I've got plenty of time to respond to her action in her footstep. Right? Can you guys see that from there? Let's try it this way. Right. So again, I'm assuming a wider measure, and I'm not just launching at her, and I'm certainly not just launching at her blade, but I'm carefully deciding where I'm putting myself. I'm using the same fundamental principle, which is cutting a swath, forcing her to go to the predictable place, right? But in a distance at which she can't hit me without making another step. And when she does, I'm responding to that action.
Questions?
I'm using her commitment against her, which is fundamental essentially to every sword system.
Yep.
Bob Sharon once explained Fiore to me as the hokey pokey. You want to make them put their foot into the middle.
And shake it all about?
Shake it all about. You're going to be the one shaking it all about.
I don't like that.
Make them step at you, because that's the tempo of commitment in which you know where they're going to be when. And it's that distance of this, it's that center.
It's almost 10:30.
I know. That's why I said I have no idea how much time. How long.
Almost 2 hours.
I'll say honestly, at least on this other end, it's not that notable.
Oh, the big
planes?
helicopter?
Okay,
That's
great.
awesome.
Point being is that that when they put their foot into the center, the distance at which the final commitment happens, where you start to be able to actually reach people,
Right.
that's all. Every motion up into that point is that goal of you commit to me, and I just hit you.
sorry.
And what's great about this is I don't have to have a long lunge for this.
Nope.
I don't have to be tall for this.
Nope.
I want you coming at me.
Right. Any questions?
Any question? All right.
So,
as we
that's-
established,
This is that wraps up kind of
Yeah.
the basics of cuts.
cuts.
And by basics, we mean we fire hosed you with a lot of information for
Tonight was a long
6 or
was a
7
while.
hours.
Yeah.
So wrist cuts, elbow cuts, shoulder cuts, totally your friend. Next session, we flip everything that we've said in the last 3 sessions on its head.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes.
It's the flip session, right?
Yeah, it's the flip session. What we're gonna do next episode
Next episode.
is we're gonna talk about using wrist cuts with longswords and using shoulder cuts with rapiers.
Yeah.
And when because we talked about tonight about maximizing your weapon efficiency, right? That a rapier isn't really designed to be throwing these heavy shoulder cuts from out of measure. Well, when is a good time to throw a shoulder cut with a rapier? When is a good time to throw a wrist cut with with a
with a
longsword,
longsword.
and how do you do those things?
Because it absolutely exists. These are all generalities with a whole lot of it depends in the middle.
So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. I know I am. This was your favorite class?
This is totally my favorite class because it's
Next
I
week's
get to
probably
play-
my favorite class.
I get to play with my favorite weapons.
Excellent.
I am incredibly excited. Like,
Pardon me?
I know you were excited about shoulder cuts, but oh, sorry. I was gonna say I know you were excited about shoulder cuts, but I'm so excited for the next class. Like, that one is, as soon as I saw it, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Well-
I'm making flailing hand gestures, even though you can't see.
Weapon arms. I mean, like I say, the reason that I was excited is because we get to play with the weapons I love.
Yeah. We'll get to play with longswords next week too.
I know. I'm super excited by that. So we'll see you next time on Pandas on Parade. Yay!